142 years ago, in 1884, a young boy was ill, and to keep him amused, his father gave him a magnetic compass. The boy was enthralled. He was fascinated by how, whichever way he held his, the needle always seemed to point north. 70 years later, Albert Einstein would say that it was the compass that made him consider whether there was an invisible force acting in the universe. And as we know, he spent the rest of his life dedicated to discovering this force. Cut to 2010, and a young village girl named Monica was having a pretty rough time. She had been performing terribly in school, and to make things worse, her father had said he was going to marry her off at the first available opportunity. Monica happened to visit the Agastya Foundation's campus in Kuppam as part of a school trip. And on that particular day, they were demonstrating how blood tests are conducted. Monica volunteered her finger, it was pricked, and a drop of her blood was analyzed to reveal her blood group. She was electrified by this experience. She could not understand how there was information trapped in a single drop of blood. She went back to school eager to learn more about science, and gradually her grades improved. At some point, she confronted her father and asked whether he'd be willing to allow her to study further. But the man refused. So Monica made a deal with him. If she stood first in school that year, would he relent and allow her to study further? Now, money was tight. Monica's father was a fallen, but nonetheless, he agreed, perhaps thinking that there was no way that she could stand first. As you can imagine, the story does have a happy ending. Monica did, in fact, stand first, and her father, being a man of honor, allowed her to go to college. She went to the Padmavati College in Tirupati. At Agastya, we love stories like this, little anecdotes that show you the power of sparked curiosity and the lengths we're willing to go to if we have the appetite to learn. Monica's story and Einstein's story have one important thing in common. They show you the value of inciting. At Agastya, we call these pinprick moments, tiny inflection points that change our own perceptions of who we are and what we're capable of, and push us to becoming more curious versions of ourselves. Curiosity, by the way, is one of Einstein's greatest skills, according to him. I have no great talent, he said. I'm merely a passionately curious individual. In my book, The Moving of Mountains, I describe how the Agastya Foundation has used curiosity as the bedrock for its curiosity-based, hands-on experiential learning model that it is now taken to 30 million underserved students, over 300,000 government school teachers across 24 states in India. As the cover of my book illustrates, Agastya's 25-year journey from a fledgling non-profit here in Bangalore to the world's largest creativity lab is nothing short of remarkable. Today, with over 300 mobile science labs, a slew of science centers all across the country, peer-to-peer learning networks, digital learning networks, and a night school that runs in 600 Indian villages, Agastya is managing to take creativity learning and design thinking to the remotest parts of India. At the heart of all this is Agastya's glorious 172-acre campus in Kuppam, Andhra Pradesh, which serves as an ideation hub, as a creativity theme park, and as an ecological success story all rolled into one. Every day, Agastya's campus welcomes about 700 students from the surrounding schools and villages, and they come there to learn from Agastya's instructors, or igniters as we call them. They come to use their labs, they come to use the facilities and the resources to better their understanding. I should mention, Agastya is not a school. It is a school for school whose mission to spark curiosity, nurture creativity, and take the innovative spirit is something that it tries to bring to every student and teacher that it reaches across the country. So how did this come about? Did these guys have any underlying vision, or were they just stumbling from one thing to the next, hoping to make something stick? While researching my book, I learned that in order to do what it did, Agastya consciously and deliberately leveraged the power of anecdotal experiences to build its creativity model for nationwide dissemination. In the early 2000s, Agastya's interventions were producing plenty of anecdotes, much like Monica's, and that might have been enough if what the foundation wanted was to remain a small regional outfit. But Agastya realized that each anecdote was providing valuable insights into a child's learning journey, into what turns them from a passive to an active to a proactive learner. And by distilling these insights, they were able to devise a pedagogy that was unique, that was highly effective, and that was very, very scalable. And while Agastya was creating these interventions and these anecdotes, their own growth journey was producing plenty of counterintuitive insights into how an organization should scale up. Insights that I think any NGO, any social entrepreneur, and in fact, any corporation would do extremely well to learn from. For instance, Agastya showed that you don't need a team of classical experts to change a system. Of Agastya's original team of 5, only one person was an educator. The others were a banker, a stockbroker, a nuclear scientist, and a CEO. It was hidden in their own ignorance about education that they realized that because they did not have all the right answers, they needed to be asking the right questions. And the moment they applied this questioning mindset, this spirit of inquiry to their own methods, did they realize how powerful it could be if a child was imbibed with the same ideas. By the way, questioning is not a straightforward thing. A study in the US shows that 98% of children between the ages of 2 and 4 ask questions. But by the time the child graduates high school, that number has dropped to 25%. Here in India, I think many of us are aware, asking too many questions in a classroom can often get you in trouble. Agastya saw this as the root of a problem that it described as a crisis of curiosity in education. And by removing the dogma of fear from the learning process, they wanted every child to walk into a classroom or any discussion entitled and feeling they could ask the most ridiculous questions rather than be happy with some prepackaged answer. The second thing Agastya showed was that, contrary to subscribed wisdom, you don't necessarily need a lot of money to trigger something like curiosity or creativity. In fact, a lot of the times, the lack of funds is probably the ultimate catalyst towards design thinking. Take this tiny toy that I have in my pocket, for example. At first, it seems unremarkable, but we've slowed it down to show you that at some point when you turn it, it flips. That's not CGI, by the way. That's exactly how it looks when it happens. I would do it here, except I'm not very good at not letting it fly off in one direction. The toy, as we call it, the tippy top, is Agastya's vehicle for what we say is aha, and ha, which is the route that the mind takes when it's making its creative journey. When you see it at first, there's nothing so remarkable about it. But the moment it flips, and I know many people who see it flip for the first time get quite amazed, that is, as we call it, the moment. The moment where the mind goes, hey, what's going on here exactly? Why is this thing doing this very counterintuitive jump? Now, the science behind the tippy top and the maths is actually quite complicated. But if you do learn why it does what it does, then that becomes your aha moment. We've all heard about the aha moment when you learn the answer to something and you go, okay, now I get it. Now I get why it's doing that. We've seen it in science, in economics, in most fields that we work. We wait for that moment when the answer is finally revealed to us. But that's not the whole journey, because the third is the ha. That is the joy and the confidence that you get from having the answer, and the fun you can have from applying that answer in different areas of your understanding. That picture that you see, by the way, is of Niels Bohr and Wolfgang Pauli in 1951, 2 Nobel laureates at the peak of their prowess, leaning over the tippy top, marveling over why it does what it does, using their vast reservoirs of ha to explain why this tiny 20 rupee toy that you get in Channapatna is doing what it's doing. Ha is something that Agastya believed was crucial to education, taking the joy of learning back to the villages, to underserved children in government schools, and bringing them to a point where they wanted to know more and do more with what they do. It became Agastya's ultimate vehicle for its 4 C's, namely curiosity, creativity, confidence, and caring. If you instill a child with curiosity and creativity, you boost their confidence levels. And a confident child can be used to create a culture of caring wherein children don't just pull themselves up, but use their knowledge, use their ha to pull up their entire communities. But what about impact? Joy in learning is a wonderful thing, I understand that, but were Agastya's interventions having any tangible impact? over the years. We've done a lot of impact studies internally and externally to show the effects that Agastya's outcomes were having. And one of the things we found was that there were studies done, and some of those studies had very heartwarming consequences. I'm going to share some of them with you. A study done recently by a team of researchers from Texas A&M looked at both science knowledge as well as gender stereotypes in science. This study was done in the borderlands area of Assam. This was, by the way, Agastya's first foray into the Northeast, which remains sadly a highly underserved area as far as education is concerned. And so it is very heartwarming to understand that Agastya's limited intervention there, it has just started, produced a 14% increase in overall science knowledge. Some years ago, a friend and I were discussing the gender bias in the IT industry. Why are there so many boys in IT versus women? And one of the articles that I'd read said that this was possibly because computer games, when they first came out, appealed more to boys than girls. And computer games being the first gateway to computers, more boys ended up getting into that line, and that created this foundational bias that has gone on to shape the industry. But of course, this is a little bit misleading. Computer games those days were very male-oriented. Games like Donkey Kong and Space Invaders and Super Mario and Pac-Man, unlikely to entice a lot of young girls into getting interested in computer science. And so the bias can often be extremely foundational and at a grassroots level needs to be understood. When Agastya started asking why there aren't more girls in STEM, one of the feedbacks from the field was that while it was easy for igniters to encourage boys with a pat on the back or a high five, they couldn't really interact with girls in much the same way. Agastya's remedy was quite simple. Stop interacting whatsoever, treat all the kids the same, and see what happens to the classroom dynamic. And again, anecdotally, the feedback came back that yes, girls are putting their hands up a lot more. They are participating in a more engaged manner in discussions. They're coming to the front of the class from the back. This slide, which was also part of the study, confirms Agastya's methods in how it treated gender stereotypes in STEM. It shows that not only are more girls interested in STEM, but the perception of boys that whether girls should or should not be in STEM is gradually improving, and that more boys believe that girls, whether that's STEM rather, should be an equal opportunity field for both boys and girls. And I think when you influence something like that at a foundational level, these kids, as they grow up, take these ideas with them and truly bring a positive change to society at large. The final slide I'm going to share with you is with regards to the distribution of Agastya's kids, Agastya alumni. As I told you, Monica's father was a farmer, and a lot of the kids that we meet come from agrarian backgrounds. However, we now see that they're entrepreneurs, tech startups, they get into PhDs, they've even become YouTubers. And anecdotally, that's very nice. These kids come back saying, Agastya had a huge influence on my life. But at a macro level, you start seeing the impact that Agastya is having from moving kids who would have otherwise grown up and been stuck in the primary sector into the secondary and the tertiary sectors. The last thing that Agastya did very interestingly was to scale up in a way that is truly unique. A Stanford mathematician by the name of Tadashi Tokeda that I interviewed while writing the book mentioned that while Agastya operates at a macro level, where in 24 states we reach 30 million children, the actual impacts we have are at a much more micro level. In this sense, Agastya traverses a very interesting mesozone, wherein micro and macro somehow find this Goldilocks area, wherein the scale or the ambition of scale somehow does not dilute the micro impacts, the pinprick moments as we call them, which happen at an individual level. Now, I've written in my book extensively about how an organization like Agastya uses different mechanisms to retain this balance and stay in a mesozone. But I think it is imperative for any organization that is looking to scale up without losing the soul of what made them special in the first place to understand how to operate in a mesozone. Fundamentally, I think what Agastya has done is to show that this idea that elementary education is for the poor, but that creative learning is for the elite, is something we no longer need to subscribe to. Today, teams from Harvard and MIT are coming to Agastya to learn the very same concepts that the kids are learning in the villages and in the government schools across the country. I'm going to end with Monica's story just quickly again. Uh, as I mentioned, she went to Padmavati College, and there she studied horticulture. And today she works with the government in that very same capacity. Monica was a student leader at Agastya, and she spoke at once to an audience much like this about her pinprick moment, about the moment that changed her own perception of how she was going to live her life. And today she supports her family, and if asked, she will tell you that yes, it was her innators, instructors at Agastya who moved her in a direction that she would have otherwise probably not found herself going in. When Agastya first started out, the key question they wanted to ask themselves was, do we want to fill a glass of holy water, or do we want to raise the level of the ocean by a millimeter? That is to say, do we want to focus our energies elevating just a few children to a very high level, or do we want to spread our energies so that all children, an entire generation of children, would have access to creativity, curiosity, and innovative thinking, letting them all understand just a little bit more about how to enjoy this process? I think Agastya chose the latter, and that was the right decision. But today, with a quarter of a century behind them, with tens of millions of pinprick moments already gone and tens of millions more to come, we might be in a position where we need to consider whether Agastya may not be uniquely and wonderfully positioned to raise a holy ocean. Thank you.